It is true that some people are more vulnerable to the problem of addiction more broadly than others. We used to call this the addictive personality. Now we don't call it that anymore. We don't think of it as medical terminology, or at least it's not current medical terminology. We talk about people having vulnerability or risk factors for the disease of addiction. And it is definitely true that if you have a biological parent or grandparent, even if you're raised outside of that substance using home, that you are at increased risk of developing an addictive disorder yourself compared to the general population.
Welcome to the Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home for 1 cent solutions to $64,000 questions. I'm your host, Dr. Ted Achacoso. Among today's $64,000 questions are: number 1, how is 1 hit of a meth pipe equal to 10 orgasms? Number 2, in 2012, enough opioids were prescribed for every American to have a bottle of pills, and opioid overdoses killed more Americans than guns or car accidents. Why? Number 3, how can 1 get addicted to pain? Or what is the pain-pleasure balance or the opponent process theory? Giving her 1 cent solutions is our guest, Dr. Anna Lembke. Dr. Anna Lembke received her undergraduate degree in humanities from Yale University and her medical degree from Stanford University. She's currently professor and medical director of addiction medicine, Stanford University School of Medicine. She's also program director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She's a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and a diplomat of the American Board of Addiction Medicine. Dr. Lembke is a specialist in the opioid epidemic in the United States and author of Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. Another book, a New York Times bestseller, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, was released in August 2021. Dr. Lembke also appeared in the 2020 Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma.
Dr. Anna Lembke, welcome to the SNH podcast. I was going to ask you the first question that always happens to me when I'm in the clinics, when I discover that one patient of mine has an addiction, say to Adderall, then I uncover other behavioral addictions accompanying it. Is this a common occurrence for you? Like when someone is referred to you for a certain addiction, or when you see a patient with a certain substance addiction, that you uncover co-occurring addictions? And what is the probable reason for this?
This is pretty common, and I think it's especially common when it comes to sex, pornography, and compulsive masturbation, because there's an extraordinary amount of shame associated with those types of behaviors, maybe even more so than with other types of addictions. I remember vividly a patient who came in and seemed very nervous. And when we asked him, why he was there, he talked about taking too much Advil. And an Advil is an over-the-counter
Yes.
anti-inflammatory pain reliever. And, it can happen. I mean, people can abuse over-the-counter medicines and get addicted to them. It's quite uncommon, but it can happen. So, we went through all that, and he described the behavior, and we talked about, what we might do about it. And the session ended, and he went home, and then he gave me a phone call later and said, well, in fact, what I really want help with is my sex and pornography addiction. I just didn't feel comfortable saying it in the room. So those things do happen.
But they do open up later, don't they?
Yes. So I think there's kind of a testing process, right? Is this a safe space? Is this somebody I can trust?
I see.
Is this somebody who knows what she's doing? And I think, once they feel that there's some comfort there, then they're more likely to open up.
So is the reverse also true? Like, for example, there's a substance addiction, and then you uncover behavioral addictions, or is the converse also true, where you have seen this, say, sex addiction, and then you actually see an accompanying substance addiction?
Again, very, very common. That's more often related to people not considering their substance use a problem, right? They don't see it as an addiction, or they don't see it as problematic, or maybe they just don't want to change it, even if they recognize that it's true. So And sometimes people come in not wanting specific help for any kind of addictive process. They want help with depression, with anxiety, with
I
inability to
see.
sleep, with inattention. And then over the course of the workup that we do, we detect that in fact there is a co-occurring addictive problem. And then there's that whole gentle persuasion to get them to look at that as related to their depression, their anxiety, or whatever brought them in.
I have a friend who is actually addicted to alcohol, and you know, and unfortunately, is also addicted to cannabis. And his claim is always this: it's like, I have an addictive personality. Is it true that people have addictive personalities?
It is true that some people are more vulnerable to the problem of addiction more broadly than others. We used to call this the addictive personality. Now we don't call it that anymore. We don't think of it as medical terminology, or at least it's not current medical terminology. We
Mm-hmm.
talk about people having vulnerability or risk factors for the disease of addiction. And it is definitely true that if you have a biological parent or grandparent, even if you're raised outside of that substance using home, that you are at increased risk of developing an addictive disorder yourself compared to the general population. Some of the data suggests that about 50% of the risk of getting addicted is inherited or innately biological. So it's really true that that innate risk is there. Um,
But the
it's a
environment
complex
completes it, right?
polygenic phenomenon. It's not going to be one addiction gene. We do know that it is related to things like impulsivity, which is the tendency to act before we think. We also know it's related to emotion dysregulation, people who tend to get highly emotionally dysregulated. We know that it co-occurs at a higher rate with people who have psychiatric disorders, especially things like bipolar disorder and attention deficit disorder. So there's clearly, an innate vulnerability.
I see. When I see patients with like Adderall addiction or addiction substances, I actually do not treat them um, um, as drug addicts. I started a specialty called health optimization medicine, where I take a picture or a snapshot of the metabolome, and then I adjust everything that's like hormones, nutrients, etc., in the metabolome to back your when you are between um, you know 21 and 30 years old. However, I do refer my patients to psychiatrists all the time after I've done that. Now that the biological stage is already all clear, now let's take a look at the behavioral stuff that's going on with you. And it does take a while. For example, my best response for an Adderall that's a 4-year addiction, for example, has been like 6 months, and that's best.
Mm.
You know, uh,
Mhm.
I remember when training in pharmacology and toxicology, I was given a patient who was an ethanol alcohol addict. And my job was to monitor how much he was going to be drinking for the entire month, and then decrease that for the next month and decrease it again for the next month. It was very tedious, but it had to be done, right? What do you think of those gradual steps uh, decreasing the amount of the addictive substance over time rather than total abstinence immediately?
Mhm. Mhm. So it depends on the person and it depends on the substance. When it comes to prescription medications like Adderall or other stimulants, benzodiazepines, Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, etc., or opioids prescribed for the treatment of a medical condition, typically we do recommend a slow and gradual taper in those instances. In large part because withdrawal from especially benzodiazepines can be life threatening. We also sometimes do that with alcohol, where we do exactly as you did and have the individual slowly decrease the amount of alcohol that they're using over time, again, to stave off potential life-threatening alcohol withdrawal. Although I will say I've only had one patient in the past 10 years who was able to do that with alcohol. Very, very, very difficult. You have to really have a kind of be an exceptional person and have an exceptional situation to do that.
that was the bane of my training, that one person where I had to monitor for an
Yeah,
entire
right.
year. It does require a lot of patience.
Right.
I, I'd like to
We learn a lot from our patients. But having said that, I will add. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, having said that, the data show. Are you still there?
yeah, I am.
Okay, great. The data show that, for example, when it comes to quitting smoking, so quitting nicotine products, the best outcomes, if you look at clinical trials, is when people set a specific quit date and go cold turkey on that date, as compared with slowly decreasing the amount over time. And in my
Mm.
clinical practice, when I'm dealing with things like cannabis or cocaine, or even in some cases opioids, or sometimes, although rarely, benzodiazepines, certainly process addictions, gambling, pornography, shopping, video games, I do recommend setting a specific quit date and going cold turkey on that date, getting all the drug out of the house, decreasing access to the drug, because I find that's just mentally, people tend to be more successful with that.
It's the cle- I usually recommend that they clear out their environment, right? Much like when I am trying to uh, when orthopedic surgeons ask me to decrease the weight of people that they're going to do surgery on, like of the knees, and I ask them to give, I do a calculation, but at that time I'm also calculating how much time I will have to clear their pantries of all of the things that they shouldn't be eating in those months, other aside from all the other interventions that you should do to get them to the weight such that by the time they do their surgery, when they stand up, it's not going to do damage on the new knees that have been placed in. But uh, anyway, and I must confess that I read your book twice. Once was as a digital text, and I know you threw away your Kindle. Um, and the other was as an audiobook, and I really loved the audiobook because I was only having cognitive empathy for the patients, like, oh, they sound like patients in my clinic, right? When you were writing about them, but when you were expressing how they were saying these things to you, it's sort of like, it basically reactivated circuits in my brain of how patients would actually talk to me, and that was great. So I would, if I wrote a book that required reading, I would ask you to do it.
Well, thank you. That's such a wonderful compliment, and I'm very honored that you read the book not once but twice, and the second time you listened to it. That's very that means a lot to me. Thank you.
Look, it's very for me. It was a very important book in two sense. Now, two senses of it. Number one is that in the first third, you basically told us about the statistics of how really bad the addiction problem is, and I remember I read your first book, Drug Dealer MD,
Hmm.
and with basically outlining the magnitude of the problem and then discussing the magnitude of the problem. I just bought a passive solar house in West Virginia as a weekend house, and it's being renovated. And the contractor told me that he was going to be working alone. And I said, why? He said, I cannot train any of these young guys. He said, they report to work and then they disappear from work and they're always high. And he said, oh my God, this is the extent of opiate addiction that we have. Can you give us some statistics in your head that you can roll out your tongue on how grave this problem is for us? And even just discounting the behavioral addictions that we have, like porn and so on, just a substance addiction that we're facing.
Sure. So, I mean, the last 50 to 100 years has seen a gradual and striking increase in drug use in populations all over the world, particularly in the United States. And correlating with that, we've seen a corresponding massive increase in drug-related overdose deaths. So, since the year 2000 up till now, cumulatively, approximately 700,000 Americans have died of drug overdoses, and the majority of those have been in some way related to opioids. So the opioid epidemic, which began with the increased prescribing of prescription opioids for minor and chronic pain conditions, and then transitioned around 2012, 2013 to illicit opioids like heroin, and now illicit fentanyl, which is much more deadly than most prescription opioids or heroin in very small amounts. Has really exploded this terrible epidemic. But it's not just opioids. If you look at the United States population as a whole, 50% of Americans have tried an illicit drug in their lifetimes. Now that includes cannabis, which, as you know, is illegal at the federal level in the United States, but legal in many states at the state, both medical and recreational level. But that statistic alone is really impactful. What it says is that it has become almost normative for people to use drugs that are illegal in order to, achieve some other end, to change the way they feel. And we do know that about a quarter of individuals who use illicit drugs will go on to develop a drug use disorder or addiction. It's a growing problem. It's a very serious problem. The most common cause of death in Americans under the age of 50 is drug overdose. And these are accidental drug overdoses by and large, not intentional suicides. So we're seeing really an unprecedented amount of substance use and substance use disorders, otherwise known as addictions, in our time. And I really do think it represents a kind of modern plague where we're going to continue to see problems related to substance use and substance use disorders and other addictions, as we move on through this century and into the centuries to come.
Anna, you mentioned something about cannabis. I read somewhere that the addiction rate for cannabis is 10%, or do you have another figure?
Yeah, so the figure that's most often cited is a 9% of people who use cannabis will go on to develop a cannabis use disorder. And lifetime prevalence of all drug use disorders is about 10 to 12% in the population. So that's not inconsistent with drug use disorders more broadly.
There's a line that I actually loved in your second chapter in the book, Running from Pain. You said, in 2012, enough opioids were prescribed for every American to have a bottle of pills, and opiate overdoses killed more Americans than guns or car accidents. That is severe.
Yes, it really represents a pivotal moment in American history. We've had opioid epidemics in our history in the past. There was the narcomania of the late 1800s, the early 1900s, when morphine was sold as a cough and cold remedy right next to Bayer aspirin, but eventually morphine was made illegal. And that opioid epidemic largely resolved until the Vietnam era, when we had a lot of our soldiers coming home addicted to opium and to morphine, most of which resolved upon returning to the United States because access to opioids was limited once they were home. But starting in the 1990s, we saw a huge escalation in access to opioids, mainly through a doctor's prescription. So doctors started prescribing opioids for minor and chronic pain conditions, leading to a commensurate increase in opioid addiction. And then ultimately, as we're seeing now, this transition to illicit opioids. So we're really, the opioid epidemic is real. It's tragic. It's largely a market-driven epidemic, and the solutions are complex.
And it's just too bad that we have opiate receptors in our system. I'm kidding. Anna, knowing that we have all of these issues, I loved it that your book actually went back and had moments of evolutionary investigation on the role of dopamine in evolution, and we know that it's very much involved in movement, and it's also involved in learning. And from here, how can you outline for us, for example, from learning and movement and the progression of that now to our abuse of the system in terms of our reward mechanism?
Sure. So dopamine was discovered as a neurotransmitter in the human brain in the 1950s, so that wasn't all that long ago. And since then, there's been an explosion of research on dopamine, revealing dopamine as the most important neurotransmitter for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It may be even more important for motivation than it is for pleasure per se. There's a very famous experiment in which rats were engineered to have no dopamine receptors in their reward circuitry. And what the scientists found was when they placed food in those rats' mouths, the rats ate the food and seemed to get pleasure from the food. But if they put the food even a body length away, the rats would starve to death. So in other words, the absence of dopamine depleted the rats' desire to do the work to get the reward that gives them pleasure.
Ooh, a new weight loss mechanism. I'm kidding.
Right, right. Yeah, probably not one that you would want to pursue. It ends in death. And also, we've known for quite some time, too, that dopamine is essential to movement. So, for example, Parkinson's disease is characterized by depletion of dopamine in a different part of the brain than the reward circuit, a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And it's no coincidence that the same neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, reward, and motivation is also involved in movement. Because, of course, most organisms, in order to get their reward, they have to move toward it. So it makes a lot of evolutionary sense that those two things would be combined. As I talk about in the book, one of the big problems now for human beings is that we don't actually have to move to get our reward. We can sit on the couch and swipe right and swipe left. So that's a big problem.
And have food delivered to us.
Yes, that's right. We have pretty much anything you want delivered. Makes it very tricky. So,
a friend of mine said famously that the only reason why we move is that we have to find food for energy. Now, I was wondering whether or not whether or not plants have dopamine. I have absolutely no idea.
I think they do. So don't quote me on that, but I think that they do. And certainly, dopamine was discovered as an animal neurotransmitter well before it being discovered as a human neurotransmitter in the 1950s.
Oh, I see. Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting. Please continue now from movement and learning to how we actually use them for motivation, and then how does it go now to abuse?
Right. So one of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the past 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine like a beam on a central fulcrum, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground, and imagine that there's one of those in your brain, in your reward circuit, you'll have a pretty good idea of how pleasure and pain relate to each other. So when we do something that's pleasurable, that releases dopamine in our reward pathway, that balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But there are certain rules governing this balance. And the most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be deviated for very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And there are good evolutionary reasons for that, right? So we evolved in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, right? Mother Nature wants to make sure that we're not resting on our laurels. As soon as we find that oasis and we eat up all the berries and drink up all the water, we better be off to the next one. Right. And one of the ways that nature, Mother Nature...
dynamic homeostasis, right?
That's right. Right. Yeah. So the overarching rule governing that pleasure-pain balance is that it wants to return to that level position. Our brains will work very hard to get it back to a level position. And that level position is what neuroscientists call homeostasis. So then the question is, how does the brain do that? And this is the key piece. The brain returns to homeostasis first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So I eat a berry from the berry bush, I get a release of dopamine in my reward pathway, my balance tilts to the side of pleasure. No sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to that increased dopamine by downregulating my own dopamine production and transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. That's called neuroadaptation. And I like to imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of my balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance. So they stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's the come down, the hangover, the after effect.
The neuroadaptation that you're talking about, that's also the basis for our behavior for hedonic adaptation, right? Where
Yes.
we don't find pleasure anymore for things that used to give us pleasure, and now we want more and more and more.
Yeah, so you cut out there a little bit, but I think I got most of it. Right. So that gets to the second rule of the balance, which is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar pleasurable stimulus, that initial deviation to pleasure gets weaker and shorter. That's called tolerance. But that after effect to pain gets stronger and longer. And this is a really fascinating characteristic of this reward circuitry, that if we continue to expose our brains to a certain pleasurable stimulus, we pay a huge price for that. And that price is those neuroadaptation gremlins, which start to multiply and
Mm-hmm.
accumulate on the pain side of the balance. And pretty soon we've got enough gremlins on that pain side to fill this whole room. And now we're in what's called a dopamine deficit state. We've actually changed our hedonic thresholds such that
Mm-hmm.
now we need to use our drug not to get high and feel good, but just to counteract the gremlins and level the
Just to feel
balance, and
normal. Yeah.
just to feel
Just to
normal.
feel
And
normal. Yeah.
right. And importantly, when we're not using, we're walking around with a balance that's tilted to the side of pain. We're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, inattention, and craving.
Sounds
And
like
we will
me.
do, right. That sounds like the human condition, doesn't it? Uh,
Yes.
and we will work very, very hard, to get our drug when we're in that state, because again, that drive toward homeostasis, that drive to want to level the balance, is one of the most powerful drives that is governing all living organisms and indeed living systems. And
What was that?
that's
Sorry,
essential.
Anna.
That's okay.
Sorry, Anna. What was that study again? Where the one who defined the severity of addiction as the action that you would the, the the extent of the action that you would take in order to get your reward, something like
Right. So
that.
that was my colleague, Rob Malenka, who's a very
Yes, yes.
wonderful and accomplished neuroscientist who's studied addiction in a lot of different animal models. And he says the way that he defines addiction based on his animal models is how hard is the animal, usually a mouse or a rat, willing to work in order to get a certain drug. And the harder that animal is willing to work, the more addicted they are.
Yeah, I found that when you put it in the book, I really found that very striking. It's like that's a very good way to evaluate yourself on how extremely addicted you are to something, the lengths that you would go through in order to get something to get your jollies, right? I'm sorry for
Yeah.
interrupting again, Anna.
Oh no,
Please
that's
continue
okay.
with your
That's
train
great.
of thought.
You have this, bubbly personality. It's great. I do want to jump in though on that and say that one of the ways that I kind of reframe that idea
Yeah.
is to think of people with addiction as being the most tenacious, hardworking people you'll probably ever meet. Um, in some ways, they're quite remarkable, right? The extent to which they're willing to go to get their drug of choice. Of course, the work is channeled in a maladaptive direction. That's how we define addiction: the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. But if you think about it again from an evolutionary perspective, this pleasure pain balance and these gremlins and this reward circuit evolved over millions of years of evolution for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. And in a world of scarcity, you definitely want to have people with the propensity
Yes.
for addiction in your tribe,
Yes.
right? Those are the ones who are going to find that berry bush that otherwise everyone would starve.
Yes, unfortunately, in our day and age, Hannah, when I lecture uh, on why our bodies are made for the paleo times, I said you don't go around and forage and arrive at an oasis where you could see a pineapple, banana, blackberries, blueberries all in the same oasis.
That's for sure.
And
A
this is
a
the land.
blueberry as big as your fist. Yeah, you
Yeah,
don't get
and
that anymore.
This is you're talking really about the land of plenty, which is not a
Right.
problem for, not also a problem for addiction, but a problem for the specialty that I started, which is the finding the root causes of health rather than the root causes of disease. And these kinds of things, like how did our body evolve, and what are the mechanisms in which we're motivated to do things. I mean, um, one of my famous lines is that if you want a Schedule 1 drug, schedule white sugar or any refined carbohydrate. That should be a
Mm-hmm.
Schedule 1
Yeah.
drug. Um, um, I'd like to circle back to your balance in terms of pleasure and pain, and how does one get addicted to pain? You can get addicted to pleasure, but you also said that one can get addicted to pain. Now, how is that possible, and what's the mechanism for that?
So those neuroadaptation gremlins that I talked about hopping on the pain side of the balance in response to a pleasurable stimulus, they are agnostic to whatever the initial stimulus is. So they don't really care if it's pleasure or pain. So if the initial stimulus is pain, something like exercise, which is immediately toxic to cells, those neuroadaptation gremlins will hop on the pleasure side of the balance in order to bring it level again, and they'll stay on until it's a little bit tipped to the side of pleasure. And that's our runner's high, the endorphins that we get with physical exercise. And so that speaks to a tantalizing possibility, which is that maybe we can get our dopamine indirectly. So instead of directly pressing on the pleasure side and getting a huge spike of dopamine, followed by dopamine free fall into a deficit state, and hoping that we eventually can bring it up to baseline again with abstinence, what we do when we embrace pain or invite pain into our lives is we press on the pain side of the balance. Those neuroadaptation gremlins hop on the pleasure side. And if you look at what happens to dopamine levels during ice cold water baths or during exercise, is what you see. Instead of that spike of dopamine, you see a gradual increase in dopamine levels over the latter half of the activity. And here's the really amazing part: dopamine levels will remain elevated for hours after that activity is over,
Mm.
before going back down to baseline levels. So in other words, we are paying for our dopamine upfront. The key lesson here is we're going to have to pay for dopamine one way or another. If we get it up front, we're going to pay for it afterwards with the come down or the dopamine deficit state. If we do that too many times, we're going to end up stuck in that dopamine deficit state. It's going to be hard to change. We can change it with abstinence, but it's hard. Whereas if we pay for our dopamine by working for it up front with things that are hard, then we get our dopamine as a kind of bonus afterwards. And that's a much healthier way to go. Having said that, if we press on that pain side of the balance too much, too often, and too hard, like extreme exercise or cutting or jumping out of airplanes, which has been shown to
BDSM.
flood. What's that?
BDSM.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. So that's kind of a mixture of pleasure and pain, which is important to mention because the pleasure-pain balance is an oversimplification of the human experience. It's not always that we only experience pleasure or pain. We can experience pleasure and pain simultaneously. For example, when we eat spicy foods or in certain types of sexual engagement. So we're complex beings. But this pleasure-pain balance, is a way to understand a very important homeostatic function and also an important opponent process mechanism. There are a lot of opponent process mechanisms in the brain related to cardiovascular function, relating to
Mhm.
temperature, but also relating to pleasure and pain, which is fundamental to understanding how we get addicted.
I remember in literature, I was a junior in college, and we were reading this piece of literature, and the professor called me out and said, because the scene was this was a Spanish procession, and suddenly this gentleman kisses the feet of this maiden, while kneeling down on the soil, because it was a procession on the country road, and and it, it and then it was described as, and the woman felt half pleasure and half pain from the
Mm.
kiss,
Mm-hmm.
and the professor said, "Achacoso, what is that half pleasure, half pain?" And I said, "Orgasm, ma'am." And the whole class looked at me. It's like, Yeah, it's it's classically described. I didn't know that it's classically described in literature as an experience that's half pleasure and half pain.
Yeah, there's a
But that was
very
interesting.
yeah, that's a great example. There's a very famous photograph taken of I think it's a Chinese citizen who's being basically he's being executed through death of 1,000 cuts, where literally they're pierced with a
Hmm.
knife or a blade of some sort repeatedly until they bleed to death. And the image is very famous in large part because there is this look of that you could call ecstasy on his face. So I'm sure it wasn't pleasurable, but it's that kind of that very complicated and mysterious blending of pleasure and pain that I think is true to human experience.
And I'd like to go back to something that you said about indirect mechanisms for raising dopamine, right? And I, I was, I was looking in your book, but I suppose it's more to our level that we're speaking now in terms of the neuroscience of it. How is it that this, like, for example, cocaine or not cocaine directly releases dopamine, but the non-direct dopamine releasers like opiates or cannabis or alcohol, how do they eventually lead to dopamine? I just learned from because I was interviewing you, I had to read it a journal. It's like, oh, I should know something about this. And I'm currently addicted to GABA receptors to
Mhm.
study, and I saw there that opiates actually inhibit the inhibitor. They inhibit the GABA interneuron, and thereby allowing the free flow of dopamine because they are disinhibited. Are these the only mechanisms? Are there other mechanisms by which dopamine is released indirectly by all of these activities?
Yeah, so you're raising a really important point, which is that all drugs work by their own unique mechanism.
Yeah.
And typically, what they're doing is mimicking a substance that our body already makes, right? So when you think about cannabis, we make our own equivalent of cannabis in much less potent forms and
Yeah.
in much smaller amounts. And we have a cannabis receptor, which we've named the anandamide
Mm-hmm.
receptor, which is Sanskrit for bliss. We
Yes.
make our own endogenous opioids, and we have opioid receptors, on and on with every drug you can name. We make a version of it in our own bodies, or our body's receptors recognize that drug as similar enough to the drug that we make that it will bind and that neuron will be stimulated. But one of the really big contributions in the last 100 years in dopamine research is that the final common pathway for all of those different types of reinforcing mechanisms, whether it's through the GABAergic system or the endogenous opioid system or the endogenous cannabinoid system or what have you, they all ultimately release dopamine in that very specific circuit called the reward pathway, consisting of the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, and the prefrontal cortex. And as a result, dopamine has become a kind of common currency which
Mm-hmm.
neuroscientists can use to measure the addictive potential of a given drug.
I see. Did you see the studies? I think came out last year that the seat of spirituality is now postulated to be at the periacrodactyl gray, which is
I
like
did.
that was interesting. I said, "Oh my God, all these saints, they were just fucking high." I'm sorry.
Well, that's not how I interpret that work, but that's a whole other conversation that we could have on another occasion.
Yeah, I just put that in. I set it aside because I said this reminds me of another research or another assertion rather that Saint Therese of Lisieux, right, was known to have all of these visions and so on. And I said that looks like temporal lobe epilepsy, and it's just
Yeah.
like one of those things we
Yes.
know the biological base and neurological basis is there. But as you said, it can get very controversial very quickly.
Yes.
Um, you have an interesting illustration in your book on the amount of dopamine released, like 55% for chocolate, 100% for sex, 150% for nicotine, 225% for cocaine, and 1000% for amphetamines like Adderall. And then you go on to say that by this accounting, one hit of a meth pipe is equal to 10 orgasms. Kind of nice. But can, can you explain what happens to dopamine in its receptors when an addict to any of these substances suddenly stops? For example, opioid induced hyperalgesia.
Right. Well, I think the first point with that set of experiments is that the more dopamine that's released by a given substance and the faster that dopamine is released, the more potentially addictive. And that, I think, is a really important concept. It leads back to, for example, why sugar is so addictive. Because sugar is also a potential source of nutrients, right? You get calories from sugar. The problem with sugar is that it releases a lot of dopamine very, very quickly, much more so than the sugar that you would get from a piece of broccoli. And that is why sugar is so addictive, because you get that huge dopamine spike followed by, remember, the compensatory dopamine free fall into the dopamine deficit state. And once you're in that dopamine deficit state, you want more sugar. And if that more sugar is available because the drive to homeostasis is overwhelming, you will eat more sugar. And it's very, very hard not to do that. So those experiments, really contributed to this understanding that the quantity of dopamine released and the speed with which dopamine is released is key for understanding how addictive a substance or behavior is. Having said that, it's important to acknowledge that those experiments were done in rodents, so rats and mice. Humans are not rats and mice. For example, it's very difficult to get a rodent addicted to alcohol, whereas we know that's not true in human beings. Also, they ignore a really important concept, which is the concept of drug of choice. So what may release a lot of dopamine in my reward pathway may not release very much dopamine in your reward pathway and vice versa. There's enormous inter-individual variability, especially when you're dealing with the complex human brain.
One of my favorite cartoons, very old one, at the National Institutes of Health before was there was this rat who was so happy, and the other rat was asking, "Why are you so happy?" He said, "I was just moved from the alcohol lab to the opioid lab."
Right. And if you moved that rat from the opioid lab to the meth lab, they'd be even happier. So rats love methamphetamine, cocaine, stimulants.
So, Anna, how does opiate-induced hyperalgesia happen then?
Well, that really goes back to this pleasure-pain balance. So a person who's experiencing pain will naturally want relief from that pain. They will take an opioid, and that will go on the pleasure side. Even if they're not taking it for pleasure per se, it still works on that balance the same way. And it will either bring them to the level position or maybe even a little bit past it. But whatever your starting point is, those neuroadaptation gremlins will still counteract that result. And so the brain will adapt to that opioid by downregulating our own production of endogenous opioids and opioid receptors, downregulating our dopamine. And then pretty soon over time, we need more and more opioids to get the same effect. This is tolerance. We see this all the time when patients who take opioids chronically for pain. But even more importantly, remember that after response to pain is longer and stronger. And so ultimately, we change our pain threshold, and now we've got a pleasure-pain balance that's tilted further to the side of pain than where we started out as the chronic pain patient before we were taking opioids. And that's opioid-induced hyperalgesia. Hyper means more, algesia means pain, and we end up with more pain than we started with as a result of the opioids, which have reset our hedonic or pleasure pain set point.
When I was reading about opiate-induced hyperalgesia, I was remembering, the fundamentals for us in reperfusion medicine, where there's a reperfusion injury. Once you put in, more of the oxygen, then there's actually injury that happens instead. And that's the first thing that I put as an analogy in my head for opiate-induced hyperalgesia. Just for me to remember that it causes pain, right?
Right.
So
yeah, too much of a good thing is a bad thing.
I agree. But that chocoholics will disagree with you. After all, it's Halloween today. I forgot to greet you Happy Halloween.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
I encourage, there will be listeners to us who are actually physicians, and others will be health optimization practitioners, non-physician healthcare practitioners. And there is a chapter on your book where you made an acronym out of dopamine, right? And I highly encourage the listeners to actually remember that, because not all of our patients or clients are seeing psychiatrists, and using this mnemonic or this acronym will actually help you with the way you handle your patients or your clients. Now, I'm not going to reveal all of that. You have to get Anna's book. It's very an enjoyable one. Um, the thing that I zeroed in there is mindfulness, because mindfulness is all the rage these days. And I'm using Sam's app, Sam Harris, who's also a Stanford alum, right? And and in there he had a discussion once with another guest, and he was forced to remove the number of minutes meditated, because apparently people, the meditators, were getting a hit from that. It's like, oh my god, I shouldn't break my streak, I should keep on meditating. So how does mindfulness help with addiction, and can these mindfulness apps help?
So mindfulness, it's one of those probably overused terms now. So I always like to define it when I'm talking about it. It's the ability to observe our emotions and our thoughts without judgment, and also without trying to change them or run away from them. And people who are trying to give up a substance or behavior that's highly reinforcing for them and that they're addicted to, automatically, out of necessity, have to practice mindfulness, because when we can't reach for our drug of choice to quell our cravings or quell our negative thinking or our distressing emotions, we have to learn to sit with them. So I think it's really good to define mindfulness for our patients and to let them know that they'll be doing mindfulness, whether they like it or not, what
Uh-huh.
it is, and that mindfulness, importantly, allows us to make the really critical observation that feelings and thoughts come and go. What feels like something that will never end, in fact, will end. And if we can just sit with it and stop trying to run away from it, and maybe even go deeper into that thought or feeling that we're so afraid of thinking or feeling, we'll find it's not as scary as it first appeared.
Do you think the
As
apps help?
I was just going to say, as for apps, I think it really depends on the person. If you're a kind of an app person and those guides help you, or if you're a more isolated person and so you don't have other people or communities where you can practice with others, then it could be helpful. On the other hand, as you know, I do consider a lot of the digital content to be equivalent to a drug. And I think there's ways in which our devices, and really any app, even a mindfulness app, could be potentially bad for us and reinforcing in a way that's not healthy. You talk about Sam Harris removing the number of minutes. We actually know that dopamine is very responsive to enumeration, or giving something a number, which is why we're also responsive to the number of likes on social media, our rankings on video games, how fast we ran, or how far with our smartwatches. All of these things, we get really tied into the number. We have minds that just are drawn to numbers, and then that can become a ladder of achievement for us, which isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, I would like to remind the listeners here that I don't want them to hear the A, but it's a crucial part of the A. And I'm going to leave it to them to read the book. But
So you know what? You cut out. Can you repeat that? Because I didn't hear the first half. It cut out.
Oh,
Sorry.
I was going to tell our listeners that they have to read the acronym, but I'm going to reveal the A because it's so important. But I'm going to leave it at that because this is hard to hear for addicts, and it's called abstinence. I, I'm Anna. When you were saying a while ago that you can get addicted to a lot of things, I remember I had a phase where I was so addicted to self-help books because they were a balm to whatever ails you, right? It's like, oh, you can do this, you can do that, and it was just, and then you end up reading reading instead of doing your work, right?
Mm-hmm.
You attend so many seminars, you read all of these books, and then end up saying, well, where did my life go? You went into that addiction. So I'm going to read this next one because it's long. I strongly encourage the listeners to study the book as it gives techniques of self binding, radical honesty, and pro social shame as a way to deal with addictions. Anna, I noticed that you yourself practice honesty in your book by bearing your addiction to romance novels and how you treated yourself. Now, Helen Fisher, a renowned evolutionary anthropologist, wrote a book long time ago entitled Why We Love, The Nature and Chemistry of Romantic Love. In it, she says that there are three stages: lust, mediated by testosterone in both men and women; romantic love, mediated by high dopamine and low serotonin. In fact, the fMRIs show that those in love exhibit the same fMRI images as that in OCD; and then attachment, mediated by oxytocin and vasopressin. She goes on to say that puppy love in teenagers lasts an average of 1.7 years, and romantic love in adults lasts 18 months to 3 years with an average of 2.3 years. The way we mess it up, he says, is that we think the stages are always serial, but the stages can go in parallel. And when I parallelized this, I saw, okay, the part one will, the lust can go into sex addiction very quickly. Now, one of my close friends who I was slaving away in my computational neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience lab and doing bench research on the connectome of C. elegans. You mentioned that a few times in some of your podcast. Yes, I did work with the worm, Anna. I did count the number of times. um, I finished the connectome after 3 years of working with it. And my one of my close friends, while I was doing that, he was not involved in the project, was a psychiatrist. I challenged him if we could do a clinical research on a project entitled Romantic Love is an Addiction Treatable with SSRIs or 5-HTP. He refused, of course. I proposed this after I was the shoulder that my neighbor cried on when he was dumped by his girlfriend 30 days after being placed on the then new drug Prozac. I have two questions. Is romantic love an addiction? Because I remember my niece admitting to me when I talked to her about having a new boyfriend every 2 years and witnessing her romantic euphoria and depression, she said, Uncle Ted, I'm a serial monogamist. And second, should sudden heartbreak be treated with drugs from sudden dopamine drop? I know that Takotsubo cardiomyopathy has to be, but what about unexpected heartbreak, like sudden death of a loved one or breakup because your partner suddenly pronounces that he or she just isn't in love with you anymore?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, I think I know what you mean by the question, but I guess I wouldn't pose the question, is romantic love an addiction? I mean, romantic love is romantic love. Without
Mhm.
romantic love, people wouldn't come together. They wouldn't procreate. We wouldn't propagate our species. We wouldn't experience love in all its various forms. It would be like saying, is alcohol an addiction? Alcohol is not an addiction. Now, can romantic love be an addiction, just like alcohol can be an addiction?
Ah,
Absolutely.
yes. Okay.
Absolutely.
I get you.
And in fact, so much so is that known that there are 12-step groups for not just sex addiction, but actual love addiction. And
Mhm.
those 12-step groups are characterized by probably equal proportions of men and women, whereas in sex addiction 12-step groups, you're more likely to see predominantly men. So love addiction is real, but
Uh-huh.
it doesn't mean that we should
I,
throw romantic love out the window. Yeah,
I love it when you
yeah.
distinguish, ethanol and romantic love, and then addiction to ethanol and addiction to romantic love.
Right.
Those are
Hmm.
separate things.
Right. And as
Okay.
far as, should we treat a breakup or the loss of
Yes.
romantic love? Oh, by the way, let me back up a bit, because the
Yes.
natural question is, then how do we distinguish when we're just in love and when we may be getting addicted to love? And that's, those are judgment calls. They're judgment calls that people would make in different places.
Mm.
They would draw the line differently. I'll say two things about it. That remember, addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. We usually
Mm.
characterize it by the 3 C's: out of control use, compulsive use, and continued use despite consequences. Some of the softer signs that you won't find in the DSM-5 are behaviors that you're lying about. So if you're lying to others about how you're engaging in partnerships with other people, that might be one of the signs that maybe you are addicted to that behavior. There could be other reasons, but so anytime we're using other people as a means to an end, I think, and that end is our own self-gratification, I think we want to be very alert to the possibility that we are addicted to love. In terms of treating with drugs, I would never treat, the loss of a romantic partner with a medication as a kind of reflexive, first line treatment. I would never do that. I mean,
What
how else
about
are
a
we?
sudden death or loss of a loved one?
No, I
No?
would never do
Okay.
that because to me that's part of life. I mean, that's part
Mm-hmm.
of natural human suffering. Those events we're meant to experience. We're meant to learn from those
Mm-hmm.
experiences and emerge, and become stronger for having been able to withstand and endure and continue. Now, if there's a case of somebody for whom the loss of a partner, they lack the resilience, and it appears over time they're not coming out of
Mm-hmm.
it, and that is roughening into some kind of major depressive episode, then I might go in with a medication, but certainly not initially, and certainly not as a kind of an expectation.
Mm-hmm. See, Anna, I'm just like any other American. Um, I run away from pain.
Right. You've become Americanized, it seems.
This has been another episode of the Smarter Not Harder podcast. Smarter Not Harder is a major donor to Health Optimization Medicine and Practice Association, the educational nonprofit organization that teaches physicians and non-physician healthcare practitioners the standard of care in health, not the standard of care in disease. So can you help us by donating a bit of your time to spread the word? Head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your shows and leave us a 5-star review. And while you're at it, please go to YouTube and click subscribe. Thank you for tuning in to Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home for one cent solutions to $64,000 questions.